I was standing in the courthouse hallway, still buzzing from my victory in the Peterson case, when the process server found me. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as I tore it open, my hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline that hadn't yet subsided. Lawsuit for contested inheritance of estate of Judge David Sterling. Defendant Maya Sterling, plaintiffs Celeste and Gregory Thorne. My biological parents were suing me for my grandfather's inheritance. The people who abandoned me at 4 months old, who never showed up to a single birthday graduation or hospital visit in 30 years, wanted the $3.4 million my grandfather had left me. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet as rage and disbelief crashed over me in equal measure. My vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment, I thought I might actually faint right there in the marble hallway where I'd won countless cases for other people. Before I continue this story, if you're invested in finding out what happened next, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up against injustice. Drop a comment below telling me what you would do in my situation. Your support means everything. Let me take you back to the beginning to help you understand why this lawsuit felt like a knife twisting in an old wound that had never quite healed. It was April 15th, 1995. The hyacinths were blooming early that year in Charleston, South Carolina, their purple and white flowers filling my grandparents' front garden with a sweet, almost overwhelming fragrance. My grandmother Elena had planned to spend that Saturday planting her vegetable garden, the tomatoes and cucumbers she grew every year that would later fill mason jars in the basement. She had her gardening gloves laid out on the kitchen counter, her seed packets organized by planting depth when the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find her daughter Celeste standing there in a designer sundress, oversized sunglasses covering half her face, and a baby carrier in her hands. That baby was me. 4 months old, wearing a pink onesie that was slightly too small, clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit that I would keep until I was 12 years old, and it literally fell apart in my hands. "I need to find myself," Celeste had said, and my grandmother wrote down every word in her journal that night, her handwriting shaky with shock and grief. "David and I have dreams. We can't be tied down right now. You'll do better with her anyway. You always wanted a daughter who'd appreciate what you have to offer." She handed me over, kissed my forehead once, and walked back to the silver convertible idling in the driveway where Gregory waited behind the wheel. My grandmother stood there holding me, watching the car disappear around the corner toward downtown Charleston, the exhaust fumes mixing with the scent of hyacinths. And she didn't cry until my grandfather David came home an hour later and found her sitting in the nursery that had been meant for my mother 30 years earlier, rocking me and singing a lullaby she'd probably thought she'd never use again. My grandfather was 57, then a respected circuit court judge known for his fairness and his photographic memory of case law. He had silver hair, even then wire-rimmed glasses that he was constantly adjusting, and hands that were gentle but firm when he picked me up that evening. He looked at me for a long moment, his dark eyes serious, and then he said to my grandmother, "We raised one daughter who couldn't see what she had. Let's raise this one to know her own worth." And they did. God, they did. My earliest memories are of my grandmother's kitchen. The black and white checkered floor that I would later learn to play hopscotch on. The smell of her lemon poppy seed cake baking every Saturday morning. The way the afternoon sun would stream through the windows over the sink and make patterns on the walls that looked like dancing. My grandfather's deep voice reading to me every night before bed, everything from Dr. Seuss to simplified versions of famous trials, his finger tracing under the words to teach me to follow along. Sunday dinners were sacred in our house. Every Sunday at 6 p.m., we sat down together at the mahogany dining table that my grandmother had inherited from her mother. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden, and that lemon poppy seed cake for dessert. My grandfather would tell stories about his cases, always careful to remove identifying details, but teaching me about justice, about how the law was supposed to protect people, about the difference between what was legal and what was right. When I was 6 years old, he explained a child custody case to me in terms I could understand. Sometimes, he said, cutting his pot roast into neat, precise pieces, parents don't realize that children are people. They think of them as property, as things to be owned. But a good parent understands that their job is to raise a human being who can think and feel and make their own choices. A good parent stays not because they have to, but because they want to. I didn't understand then that he was talking about Celeste. I wouldn't understand that for years. She came back for this first time when I was 4 years old. I don't remember much about that visit, but my grandmother's journal fills in the gaps. Celeste had called a week earlier crying, saying she'd made a terrible mistake and wanted to be part of my life again. She arrived in an expensive car with Gregory, both of them tanned and cheerful, carrying gifts. A dollhouse that was too advanced for my age. A dress that was 2 sizes too big. A stuffed elephant that I was apparently allergic to because I broke out in hives within an hour of hugging it. They stayed for 3 days. On the second day, according to my grandmother's journal, Celeste asked for money. $20,000 to invest in a restaurant Gregory wanted to open in Savannah. My grandfather, ever the careful man, said he'd consider it. By the third day, they were ready to leave. They promised to come back in a month. They promised I could visit them once they were settled. They promised we'd be a real family. I waited by the front window for 6 weeks. My grandmother wrote about it with a heartbreak that still makes me cry when I read those entries. Maya asks every day when Mommy is coming. I don't know what to tell her anymore. Today, David suggested we plant the garden together to distract her, but she insisted on staying by the window. She fell asleep there, and David carried her to bed. I found him sitting in his study afterwards, just staring at the wall. He looked so old. When Celeste finally called, it was to say they'd changed their minds about the restaurant. They were going to travel Europe instead. She sent a postcard from Paris 3 months later. Having a wonderful time, it said. Thinking of you all. No mention of when she'd visit. No mention of me specifically at all. This became the pattern. They'd appear every year or two, always with a new scheme, always needing money, always making promises they'd never keep. My grandfather documented everything. He kept a file in his study meticulously organized with every check he wrote them, every promise they made, every time I waited by that window. When I was 7, they promised to come to my birthday party. I invited my entire 2nd grade class because I wanted them to meet my parents. I wore the dress my grandmother made for me, white with pink roses, and I helped make my own birthday cake. My grandfather set up a video camera because he wanted to capture the moment. 23 children showed up. Celeste and Gregory did not. My grandfather's tape from that day shows me sitting at the head of the table, smile slowly fading as I kept looking at the door. The other kids sang happy birthday. I blew out my candles, and then I went to my room and didn't come out until the next morning. My grandmother found me there lying in bed staring at the ceiling. She didn't say anything at first. She just laid down next to me and held my hand. Finally, I asked her why they didn't come. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said something I've never forgotten. Sometimes sweetheart people aren't capable of giving us what we need. That doesn't mean we're not worth it. It just means they're not strong enough to be what we deserve. When I was 9, my grandfather took me to his courthouse for the first time. He showed me the courtroom where he presided, the high bench, the American flag, the state seal of South Carolina on the wall. He let me sit in his chair and he said, "Maya, do you know what justice means?" I had learned the dictionary definition in school. Fairness, I said. Treating people right. He nodded. Justice is making sure the truth matters more than what's convenient. It's protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And most importantly, he leaned down to look me in the eye. His face serious. Justice is understanding that actions have consequences. People who hurt others don't get rewarded for it. I thought about Celeste and Gregory when he said that. I thought about all the promises they'd broken, all the times I'd waited by the window. Is it justice that they don't come see me? I asked. My grandfather's face softened. He pulled me into a hug that smelled like his aftershave and pipe tobacco. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, "they're missing out on knowing the most wonderful person I've ever met. That's their consequence. And someday they'll realize what they lost, but by then, you'll have built a life so full of people who love you that their absence won't even leave a hole." By the time I was 12, I had stopped waiting by the window. Celeste and Gregory had come to visit maybe 6 times in those 12 years, never staying more than a few days, always leaving with checks ranging from $10,000 to $30,000. They'd call occasionally, usually when they needed something. Never on my birthday, never on holidays. Just whenever it was convenient for them. I learned to build my life around the people who showed up. My grandparents, obviously. Martha, who had been hired as a housekeeper when I was 5 and became more like family than employee. She'd arrive every morning at 8, would often stay for dinner, and never failed to remember my favorite foods. My best friend Jessica from school, whose mother was a professor at the College of Charleston and who treated me like one of her own daughters. My grandfather's law clerk, a young man named Marcus, who would later become Chief Justice Avery, who treated me like a brilliant little sister and encouraged my questions about the law. When I was 14, I had my appendix out. Emergency surgery, rushed to the hospital at 2 a.m. with my grandmother holding my hand in the ambulance while my grandfather followed in his car. I was terrified, crying from the pain and the fear, and my grandmother stayed with me right up until they wheeled me into the operating room. When I woke up groggy from anesthesia, both of my grandparents were there. My grandfather had apparently refused to leave the hospital, had spent the entire surgery pacing the waiting room, had snapped at 3 different nurses who tried to make him go home and rest. The hospital needed an emergency contact and medical history. My grandfather provided everything. When they asked about my parents, he said flatly, "I am her parent. My wife and I have raised her since she was an infant. If you need legal documentation, I can have it delivered within the hour." The hospital didn't push it. Later, when I was recovering, a social worker came by to check on me. She asked gentle questions about my family, about who took care of me, about whether I felt safe. I was confused at first, still foggy from the pain medication, but my grandmother explained later that the hospital protocol required them to make sure children weren't being neglected or abused. The social worker looked at my grandparents, at the way my grandfather was holding my hand, at the way my grandmother was arranging flowers that Martha had brought at the homework my friend Jessica had dropped off so I wouldn't fall behind, and she smiled. "You have a lovely family," she said. "We tried to call Celeste," my grandfather told me that evening, his voice tight with anger. "We tried to call your father." Neither of them answered. We left messages. Nothing. 3 weeks later, a card arrived in the mail. "Hope you're feeling better," it said in Celeste's looping handwriting. "Sorry we couldn't be there. We were in California dealing with some business opportunities." The postmark was from San Diego. The date was 5 days after my surgery. She'd known I was in the hospital and hadn't come. That was when something shifted in me. I was 14, old enough to understand that this wasn't normal, wasn't okay, wasn't ever going to change. I stopped asking about them. When people at school asked about my parents, I said I live with my grandparents. When they pushed asking why, I said, "Because they're my family." My grandmother died when I was 20. Ovarian cancer diagnosed too late, spreading too fast. She fought it with the same quiet dignity she'd brought to everything in her life. 6 months from diagnosis to death. 6 months of watching this strong woman who'd raised me grow weak and tired and small. I took a semester off from law school to be with her. I'd commute back to Charleston every weekend anyway, but those last months I barely left her side. We'd sit in her garden surrounded by the hibiscus flowers she loved, and she'd tell me stories about her life, about growing up in Charleston in the 1940s, about meeting my grandfather at a church social when she was 19, about Celeste's childhood, the bright daughter who'd been rebellious and restless and never quite satisfied with what she had. She was always searching for something, my grandmother said one afternoon, her voice weak but clear. I tried to teach her that happiness comes from appreciating what you have, not always chasing what you don't, but she never learned that lesson. "Did you tell her I was sick?" I asked. It was the first time I'd brought up Celeste in years. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears. "We called her the day I was diagnosed. She said she'd come visit soon. That was 6 months ago." Celeste and Gregory came to the funeral. They arrived late after the service had started and left before the reception. I was standing by the casket numb with grief when Celeste approached me. She was wearing a black dress that was too fashionable for a funeral designer's sunglasses hiding her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and it was so formal, so distant, like she was offering condolences to a stranger. "Our loss," my grandfather corrected sharply, appearing at my side. Elena was Maya's grandmother, her mother in every way that matters. Celeste's lips tightened. "We should talk," she said, looking at my grandfather. "About arrangements, about the house, about what happens next." My grandfather's face went cold in a way I'd rarely seen. "What happens next," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "is that Maya and I grieve the loss of the most important person in our lives. Then we continue living as Elena would want us to. As for arrangements, my wife left very clear instructions in her will. I suggest you review them with your lawyer if you have any questions. Celeste started to argue, but Gregory put a hand on her arm and they left. I watched them go, watched them get into their expensive rental car and drive away, and I thought, they didn't even really see her. They came to a funeral for a woman they barely knew anymore and tried to talk about money before she was even in the ground. That evening, after everyone else had left, I found my grandfather in his study. He was holding a small leather journal, his reading glasses on tears streaming down his face. It was my grandmother's diary, the one she'd kept for as long as I could remember. He looked up when I came in, and he didn't try to hide that he'd been crying. "I've been reading her entries from when you were young," he said. "All those times you waited by the window, all those broken promises. Maya, I want you to know something." He stood up and pulled me into his arms, this man who had been my father in every way that mattered. "You deserved better than them," he said. "You deserved parents who showed up, who kept their promises, who loved you enough to stay. But you got something else instead. You got Elena and me, and while we weren't perfect, we loved you with everything we had." "I know, Grandpa," I whispered, holding on to him tight. "I know." 10 years before he died, he showed me his will. This was 3 years after my grandmother passed, and I'd established a routine of coming home to Charleston every Sunday for dinner. I'd finished law school past the bar and started working as a prosecutor in Charleston. I loved my job, loved fighting for justice the way my grandfather had taught me, loved the feeling of standing up in court and knowing I was doing something that mattered. That particular Sunday after Martha had cleared the dishes and left us with coffee and the last slices of her lemon poppy seed cake, my grandfather asked me to come to his study. He pulled out a thick document, the kind of formal legal paperwork I'd been learning to read and write. "This is my will," he said simply. "I want you to read it." "Grandpa," I started, uncomfortable. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted firmly. "Maya, you need to understand something. When Elena and I made this decision, we made it together carefully and deliberately. We consulted with 3 different lawyers, including Marcus Avery. We made sure it was ironclad. And we made sure it reflected our true wishes." I read the document. It was comprehensive and clear. After some specific bequests to charity and to Martha, everything else was left to me. The house, the investments, the savings, everything. It was all mine. "Grandpa," I said, tears starting to fall, "this is too much. What about Celeste? Won't she contest this?" "Let her try," he said, and there was steel in his voice. "Maya, I've been a judge for 37 years. I know how to write a will that will stand up in any court. More importantly, I know how to document the reasons behind my decisions. I have 30 years of records. Every check I wrote to Celeste and Gregory, $845,000 total, by the way. Every promise they broke. Every time you waited by that window and they didn't show up. Every birthday, every graduation, every hospital visit where they were absent." He pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer. "This is the documentation," he said. "Phone records, emails, letters I sent that went unanswered. Elena's journals. God rest her soul, where she wrote about watching your heart break over and over again. Medical records listing me as your guardian. School records with Elena and me listed as your parents for emergency contacts. Christmas cards you made for them that came back undelivered. Birthday invitations they never responded to." His voice broke slightly. "I have a video of your 7th birthday party, Maya. Do you remember that? You invited your whole class because you wanted them to meet your parents. I have footage of you watching the door waiting for them to arrive. And then I have footage of you later that night after everyone left, sitting in your room trying not to cry." I remembered. I'd forgotten. I remembered had pushed it down so deep, but sitting there in his study, I could suddenly see it all again. The white dress with pink roses. The birthday cake shaped like a castle. The way I'd kept glancing at the door every time someone new arrived, hoping it would be them. That video alone. My grandfather said his voice, fierce now, is worth more than any claim they could make about blood relation. Because family, real family, doesn't do that to a child. Real family shows up. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. "You're only 67. You're healthy. This feels morbid." He smiled sadly. "Because I want you to be prepared. Because I know Celeste and I know that when I'm gone she'll come after this money. She's always come after money. and I want you to know that you have every right to it, that you earned it not through manipulation, but through being exactly who you are, through showing up every Sunday for 27 years, through holding Elena's hand while she died, through choosing us as your family, even when biology told you that you should want something else. I chose you because you chose me. He continued, taking my hand. Every day, every Sunday dinner, every phone call where you asked how I was doing, every time you helped me plant flowers in Elena's memory. You chose to be my family, and I'm choosing to reward that loyalty, that love, that presence. The next decade, I watched my grandfather age. He retired from the bench at 73, finally accepting that 43 years as a judge was enough. He stayed sharp, though, still reading law journals, still offering advice when I had tough cases, still telling stories at Sunday dinner about famous trials and the personalities of lawyers he'd known. When I made prosecutor, he was the first person I called. I was sitting in my new office, still couldn't quite believe I'd gotten the promotion, and I dialed his number with shaking hands. "Grandpa," I said when he answered, "they offered me the position." There was a pause, and then I heard something I almost never heard. My grandfather crying. His voice was thick when he spoke. "Elena would be so proud," he said. "I'm so proud. My Maya, a prosecutor, you're going to do such good in this world." The Sunday after I got that promotion, he made a speech at dinner. Martha was there, as she often was by then, and Marcus Avery had stopped by, as he sometimes did. My grandfather stood up, raised his glass of wine, and looked at me with such love that I felt my chest tighten. 29 years ago, he said, a scared young woman left a baby on our doorstep and drove away. Elena and I looked at that baby, looked at each other, and we decided to choose love, to choose family, to raise that child as our own. He paused, his eyes glistening. And that child, that beautiful girl who became this incredible woman, chose us right back. She chose us every single day for 30 years. And now she's a prosecutor standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, fighting for justice the way Elena and I always dreamed she would. He raised his glass higher. To Maya Sterling, who proved that family isn't about biology. It's about who stays, who shows up, who loves you even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. We all drank to that, and I cried, and Martha hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and Marcus clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Your grandfather talks about you in every conversation we have, every single one. You're his proudest accomplishment." The last year of my grandfather's life was good. He was slowing down, sleeping more, but his mind stayed sharp. We still had Sunday dinners. We still sat in the garden and talked about cases. We still maintained the traditions my grandmother had started, the lemon poppy seed cake, the fresh flowers on the table, the stories. 3 weeks before he died, he helped me prepare for the Peterson case, the complex fraud case that would be my last victory before the lawsuit. He sat in his study notes spread out around him, and he walked me through the strongest arguments, the weakest points in the defense's case, the key witnesses to focus on. "You're going to win this," he said confidently. "And Maya, when you do, I want you to remember something. Every victory you win, every person you help, every time you stand up in that courtroom and fight for what's right, you're honoring everything Elena and I tried to teach you." He died in his sleep on a Thursday night in February. I'd had dinner with him that Sunday, as always. He'd seemed tired but happy. We'd talked about a case I was working on, about the garden coming back to life in spring, about whether Martha's lemon poppy seed cake recipe needed more lemon or if it was perfect as it was. When I left, he'd hugged me tight and said, "I love you, Maya. You're the finest thing Elena and I ever created, even though we didn't create you through biology. We created you through love." Martha found him the next morning when she arrived to make breakfast. She called me immediately, her voice breaking. "Miss Maya," she said, and I knew from just those 2 words. I knew before she said anything else. The funeral was enormous. Half the legal community in South Carolina showed up. Judges, lawyers, court clerks, people whose cases he'd presided over decades ago who still remembered his fairness. Marcus Avery, now Chief Justice Avery, delivered a eulogy that had everyone in tears. Judge David Sterling, he said, was the finest man I ever knew. He believed in justice not as an abstract concept, but as a daily practice. He believed in family not as a biological fact, but as a choice you make every day. And he believed in Maya Sterling with a depth and ferocity that inspired everyone who knew him. Chief Justice Avery looked at me in the front row. He once told me he continued that raising Maya was the proudest accomplishment of his life. Not his 43 years on the bench, not the hundreds of cases he decided, not the respect he earned from every person in this room. Raising Maya, being her grandfather, that was what mattered most. Celeste and Gregory came to this funeral too. Unlike my grandmother's funeral, they stayed for the whole thing. They sat in the back, which I thought was fitting. They even came to the reception afterward, mingling with people they barely knew, accepting condolences as if they'd actually lost something. I was standing with Martha and Chief Justice Avery when Celeste approached me. She'd aged, I noticed. She was 56 now, and while she was still beautiful, there were lines around her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite hide, a tightness to her mouth that suggested stress. "Maya," she said, and her voice had that same artificial warmth I remembered from childhood. "We should talk. About Dad. About the house. About everything he left behind." "This isn't the time," I said flatly. "When is the time?" she asked, and something in her voice had changed, gotten harder. "We're family, Maya. We need to discuss these things." "Family," I repeated, and I felt Chief Justice Avery's hand on my shoulder steadying me. Where was family when I graduated law school? Where was family when grandmother was dying? Where was family every Sunday for 30 years? Celeste's face flushed. "You don't understand what it's like," she started. "No!" I interrupted, and my voice was loud enough that several people nearby stopped talking and turned to look. "I don't understand how you could abandon your 4-month-old daughter and then show up 30 years later demanding to be treated like family. I don't understand how you could take $845,000 from your father over the years and never once use it to be a better mother. I don't understand how you can stand here at his funeral and talk about what he left behind when you never cared about what he was when he was alive." The room had gone completely silent. Martha was next to me, her hand on my other shoulder. Chief Justice Avery was still behind me, a solid presence. Celeste's face went from red to white. Gregory, standing slightly behind her, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "We'll talk about this later," Celeste said tightly and walked away. Martha squeezed my shoulder. "Good for you, honey," she said quietly. "About time somebody said it." 2 weeks later, the lawyer handling my grandfather's estate called me. His will was being read, he said, and I needed to be present. It was a formality, really, since my grandfather had already shown me the will 10 years ago. But legally, it had to be done. I arrived at the lawyer's office to find Celeste and Gregory already there, sitting in the waiting room with their own attorney. Not just any attorney, either. Roger Dale, one of the most expensive and notorious lawyers in Charleston, known for taking on messy estate disputes and not being particularly concerned with ethics as long as he won. This was my first clue that something was wrong. The reading of the will was exactly as I expected. Some money to charity, a generous sum to Martha for her years of service and everything else to me. The house, the investments, the savings, the family heirlooms. Everything. Celeste listened with her face getting progressively paler, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. When the lawyer finished, she stood up abruptly. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm his daughter, his only child. How can he leave me nothing?" "He didn't leave you nothing," the estate lawyer said calmly. "According to his records, Judge Sterling provided you with $845,000 over the course of your adult life." "That was different," Celeste snapped. "That was help when I needed it. This is his estate. This is family money." "With all due respect, Ms. Thorne," the lawyer said, "Judge Sterling was very clear about his intentions. He left a letter explaining his reasoning, which I'm authorized to read now if you'd like." "Read it," Roger Dale said, speaking for the first time. The lawyer opened an envelope and began to read in my grandfather's voice, my grandfather's words that I could hear so clearly it was like he was in the room. "To whom it may concern, this letter is to explain my final wishes and the reasoning behind them. I, David Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the majority of my estate to my granddaughter Maya Sterling for the following reasons. Maya came into my life when she was 4 months old, abandoned by my daughter Celeste and her husband Gregory. My wife Elena and I raised Maya as our own. We were present for every milestone, every challenge, every joy, and every sorrow. We fed her, clothed her, educated her, and most importantly, we loved her. Celeste chose to be absent from Maya's life. This was not due to inability, but to choice. Over 30 years, despite receiving significant financial support from me, Celeste visited sporadically made promises she never kept and demonstrated through consistent action that she was not interested in being a parent to Maya. Maya chose to be family. Every Sunday for 30 years, she came to dinner. She held my wife's hand as Elena died from cancer. She called me weekly just to check in. She built her career in Charleston rather than moving away because she wanted to be near me. She planted flowers in Elena's memory every spring. She earned this inheritance not through manipulation or undue influence, but through 30 years of unwavering love and dedication. Family, in my view, is not determined by biology, but by choice, by presence, by love, demonstrated through consistent action. Maya Sterling has been my daughter in every way that matters for 30 years. She deserves every penny I'm leaving her, and I hope this will provide her with security and peace as she continues her important work as a prosecutor. To Celeste, I leave my disappointment and my hope that someday she will understand what she chose to miss. The lawyer finished reading and looked up. There was complete silence in the room. Then Celeste exploded. She stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "This is insane!" she shouted. He was obviously manipulated. Maya clearly took advantage of an old man. She isolated him from his real family. Roger Dale put a hand on her arm, trying to calm her, but she shook him off. "I'm contesting this, Will," she said, looking at me directly for the first time. "I'm going to fight this, Maya. That money should be mine." "Good luck with that," I said quietly and walked out of the office. But as I walked to my car, my hands were shaking. I knew what was coming. I knew that Celeste and Roger Dale were going to make this ugly, were going to drag my grandfather's name and my name through the mud, were going to try every trick in the book to break that will. I called Amelia Vance from my car. She was my grandfather's oldest friend, a lawyer who had practiced in Charleston for 40 years and had a reputation for being absolutely brilliant and completely incorruptible. "Amelia," I said when she answered, "I need your help." When she heard what was happening, her response was immediate and fierce. "I'm not letting those vultures pick apart David's memory," she said, her voice hard. "And I'm certainly not letting them hurt you. I'll take the case." 2 weeks later, I was served with the formal lawsuit. Standing in that courthouse hallway with that envelope in my hands, the full weight of it hit me. This wasn't just about money. This was about everything. About 30 years of my life. About my grandfather's legacy. About what family really meant. And I was going to fight for it with everything I had. The first preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in late March. I arrived early, dressed in a conservative navy suit, my hair pulled back every inch the professional prosecutor I'd become. Amelia met me outside the courtroom, her steel gray hair perfectly styled, her expression calm but determined. "They're going to try to rattle you," she warned me. Roger Dale's strategy in these cases is to attack the defendant personally, make them look bad, make the jury or judge question their character. Don't let him get to you. I nodded, but my heart was pounding. I'd been in this courthouse 100 times, but always on the other side. Always as the prosecutor, never as the defendant. We walked into the courtroom, and there they were. Celeste and Gregory sitting at the plaintiff's table with Roger Dale. Celeste had clearly dressed for sympathy, wearing a modest black dress. Minimal makeup, her blonde hair simply styled. She looked like a grieving daughter, which I suppose in some twisted way she was. Gregory looked uncomfortable, his suit slightly too tight, his face already red despite the air conditioning. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Helen Morrison entered. She was in her early 60s, had been appointed to the circuit court 5 years ago, and had a reputation for being no-nonsense and extremely intelligent. I'd argued cases in front of her before and always respected her fairness. She took her seat, surveyed the courtroom, and began. "This is the matter of Celeste and Gregory Thorne versus Maya Sterling concerning the estate of Judge David Sterling. Mr. Dale, you may present your opening statement." Roger Dale stood up, buttoning his expensive suit jacket, and approached the bench. "Your Honor?" He began, his voice smooth and practiced. "This case is about justice, about a daughter who has been systematically denied her rightful inheritance by a granddaughter who took advantage of an elderly man's vulnerability." I felt my jaw clench, but Amelia's hand on my arm steadied me. Judge Sterling, Dale continued, was a brilliant man in his prime. But in his final years, he was lonely, grieving the loss of his wife, and vulnerable to manipulation. My client's daughter Maya, whom Judge Sterling and his wife raised out of the goodness of their hearts when Ms. Celeste Thorne was going through a difficult period in her life, took advantage of that vulnerability. He paused for effect. She isolated him from his biological daughter. She convinced him that Ms. Thorne didn't care about him. She positioned herself as the only family he had left, and then, when he was at his most vulnerable, she influenced him to change his will in her favor. "That's not true," I whispered to Amelia, unable to help myself. "I know," she whispered back. "Let him finish. We'll destroy him in our opening." Dale went on painting a picture of me as a calculating manipulator who had systematically cut Celeste out of her father's life. He talked about how Celeste had been a young, struggling mother who had made the painful but selfless decision to let her parents raise me. He glossed over 30 years of absence and focused on a handful of visits where Celeste had supposedly tried to be part of my life but been blocked by my grandparents. It was all lies, or at least distortions, and sitting there listening to it made me feel physically ill. Finally, Dale finished. "We will prove," he said, his voice dramatic, "that Judge Sterling's will is invalid due to undue influence and lack of capacity. We will prove that Maya Sterling manipulated an elderly man for her own financial gain. And we will prove that justice demands this will be overturned and the estate distributed according to the laws of intestate succession, which would give my client as the sole biological child the entire estate." He sat down looking satisfied with himself. Amelia stood up. She didn't rush to the podium. She took her time letting the silence build, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried perfectly through the courtroom. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is indeed about justice. But not the kind of justice Mr. Dale would have you believe. This case is about whether we as a society recognize that family is more than biology. It's about whether we honor the wishes of a man who spent 43 years on the bench serving justice, or whether we allow his legacy to be tarnished by people who abandoned their daughter and now want to profit from that abandonment." She walked toward the plaintiff's table, looking directly at Celeste and Gregory. "My clients," she said, and for a moment I thought she'd misspoken, but then I realized she was talking about me. My client, Maya Sterling, did not manipulate anyone. She was a 4-month-old infant when she was left on her grandparents' doorstep by Ms. Celeste Thorne. She didn't ask to be abandoned. She didn't manipulate her way into her grandparents' hearts. She was a baby who needed parents, and Judge Sterling and his wife Elena chose to be those parents. Amelia turned back to face the judge. "For 30 years, Maya Sterling has been the definition of family, not through biology, but through presence, through love, through showing up every single day. While Ms. Thorne and Mr. Thorne were taking $845,000 from Judge Sterling over the years, Maya was sitting at Sunday dinners. While they were making promises they never kept, Maya was holding Elena Sterling's hand as she died from cancer. While they were living their lives without any consideration for the child they brought into this world, Maya was building a relationship with her grandfather based on mutual love and respect." She paused, letting that sink in. "We will prove that Judge Sterling was of completely sound mind when he made his will. We will prove that he made this decision carefully, deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was doing and why. We will prove that Maya Sterling earned this inheritance through 30 years of being the daughter that Celeste Thorne chose not to be." She returned to our table and sat down. "And we will prove that blood doesn't make family. Love does, presence does, showing up does. And on all those counts, Maya Sterling is Judge David Sterling's true heir." The hearing continued with procedural matters, dates being set for discovery and depositions, but the battle lines had been drawn. This wasn't going to be a simple probate dispute. This was going to be a war. After the hearing, as we were leaving the courtroom, Celeste tried to approach me in the hallway. Roger Dale was beside her, probably coaching her on what to say, but before she could speak, Amelia stepped between us. "My client has nothing to say to you outside of court proceedings," she said firmly. "All communication will go through our attorneys." Celeste's face hardened. "You can't hide behind lawyers forever." "Maya," she called out, "we're going to prove what you really are, a manipulative little gold digger who stole from her own family." Something in me snapped. I pushed past Amelia and walked right up to Celeste, close enough to see the expensive concealer covering the lines around her eyes, close enough to smell her designer perfume. "My own family," I said, my voice deadly quiet. You want to talk about family. Where were you when I had my appendix out at 14? Where were you at my law school graduation? Where were you every single Sunday for 30 years? Celeste opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't done. You weren't my family, I continued, and people in the hallway were stopping to watch now, but I didn't care. Martha was my family. She made me breakfast every morning and helped me with my homework and remembered my favorite foods. Chief Justice Avery was my family. He treated me like a brilliant little sister and encouraged my love of law. My grandparents were my family. They raised me, loved me, supported me, believed in me. You were a woman who showed up every few years asking for money. That's not family. That's called being a user. Maya, Amelia said her hand on my arm again, trying to pull me back. But Celeste's face had gone red with rage. You ungrateful little bitch, she hissed. After everything we sacrificed for you. I laughed, and it was the bitter sound. What exactly did you sacrifice? Your convertible, your trips to Europe, your restaurant schemes and business ventures that you bought with my grandfather's money. You didn't sacrifice anything for me. You sacrificed me for your lifestyle. Roger Dale finally stepped in, pulling Celeste back. This conversation is over, he said firmly, and guided his clients toward the exit. I stood there in the hallway shaking with adrenaline and anger, and Amelia put her arm around my shoulders. That was either very brave or very stupid, she said. Probably stupid, I admitted. Definitely worth it, though, she said, and there was a slight smile on her face. Come on, let's get out of here. Over the next few weeks, the case started to spiral beyond just a courtroom battle. Celeste, through Roger Dale, launched a media campaign. Somehow, details of the case were leaked to the press. Local news picked it up first. Daughter sues over judge's will. Family disputes inheritance of prominent Charleston judge. Then it went bigger. A reporter from the Post and Courier wrote a lengthy article about the case, and while it was mostly factual, the headline was damning. Prosecutor accused of manipulating grandfather for millions. My phone started ringing constantly, news outlets wanting comments, colleagues calling to ask if I was okay. Friends trying to offer support, but clearly confused about what was happening. And then the social media onslaught began. Celeste had always been good with social media, had thousands of followers on Instagram from her carefully curated life of travel and luxury. She posted a photo of herself looking sad and worn, the caption reading, "Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who hurt you the worst. Family should mean something. Blood should mean something." The comments flooded in. Thousands of people who knew nothing about the situation but had opinions anyway. She deserves her inheritance. The granddaughter is clearly a manipulator. This is why you can't trust anyone with money. Blood family always comes first. There were a few supportive comments too, people pointing out that there had to be more to the story, that judgments handed down 30-year careers don't get manipulated easily. But they were drowned out by the mob. Someone created a hashtag, Justice for Celeste. It started trending locally. I tried to ignore it, but it was everywhere. When I went to the grocery store, people stared and whispered. When I went to court for my actual job as a prosecutor, defense attorneys would make snide comments about my character. Even some of my colleagues started treating me differently, more formally, like they weren't sure if they should trust me anymore. The hardest part was seeing my grandfather's name dragged through this. Articles questioning his judgment posts, suggesting he'd become senile, people who'd never met him claiming he must have been manipulated because no father would really cut off his biological daughter unless he was being controlled. I stopped reading the comments. I stopped checking social media, but I couldn't escape it entirely. One night, about a month after the lawsuit was filed, I came home to find a package on my doorstep. No return address. I brought it inside and opened it, and my blood ran cold. Inside was a doll. Old, battered, one arm, torn off the clothes, filthy and torn. It looked exactly like the doll my grandmother had described in her journal, the one I'd had as an infant when Celeste left me. There was a note printed on plain paper, so there'd be no handwriting to trace. Some things belonged to their real mothers, it read. You were never really hers. You're not really his either. Just a manipulative little thief playing dress-up in someone else's family. I called Amelia immediately. She told me to call the police to file a report about the threatening package. I did, and they took statements and photos, but realistically, there was no way to prove who sent it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my grandfather's study, the room I'd moved into my apartment when I inherited the house, surrounded by his books and his notes and his pipe that still faintly smelled like tobacco even though he'd quit smoking years ago. I found myself pulling out his journals, the detailed records he'd kept. I'd read them before, but that night I needed them. Needed to remind myself why I was fighting. I found an entry from when I was 6 years old. Maya asked me today why her mother doesn't love her, he'd written in his precise handwriting. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that some people simply aren't capable of the kind of love a child needs? How do you tell her it's not her fault without making her feel like something is wrong with her? I told her that some people have very small hearts and they fill up quickly with their own wants and needs, and there's no room left for anyone else. I told her that she has a huge heart big enough for all of us, and that makes her special. I told her that Elena and I love her enough to fill up all the spaces that Celeste left empty. She hugged me so tight after that. She said, "I'm glad I have you, Grandpa. You're the best daddy in the world." And my heart broke a little bit because she shouldn't have to think of me as her daddy. She should have a father who shows up. But since she doesn't, I'll be the best grandfather I can be, and I'll try to fill that role too. I put my head down on the desk and cried. For 6-year-old me. For my grandfather who had carried that weight. For my grandmother who had documented every broken promise in those journals. For all the years of trying to be enough, of waiting by windows, of slowly learning that biology didn't mean anything without presence. Martha found me there the next morning. She'd let herself in with the key she'd had for years, came to make me breakfast like she'd been doing since I'd moved into the house, and found me asleep at the desk surrounded by journals. She made coffee scrambled eggs and sat with me while I told her about the package, about the social media attacks, about how exhausting it all was. "Miss Maya," she said when I finished, her weathered hands holding mine across the table. "I watched you grow up. I saw you wait by that window more times than I can count. I saw your little face light up every time a car came down the street, and I saw it fall when it wasn't them. I saw your grandparents' hearts break every single time they had to comfort you after another broken promise." She squeezed my hands tighter. "But I also saw you grow into this incredible woman. Strong, kind, brilliant, everything they hoped you'd be. And I saw how happy you made them. Every Sunday dinner, every phone call, every time you'd stop by just to check in, I saw your grandfather's face light up. You gave that man joy, Miss Maya. Pure joy. And now some woman who couldn't be bothered to show up wants to take that away from you and pretend it's about justice." She stood up, her face fierce in a way I'd rarely seen. "Over my dead body," she said. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. I'm testifying at this trial, and I'm going to tell them exactly what kind of family you had and what kind of family Celeste and Gregory weren't." The depositions began in April. These were marathon sessions where both sides got to question witnesses under oath, gathering information for trial. I had to sit through hours of Roger Dale asking me invasive questions about my relationship with my grandfather, trying to find any inconsistency, any suggestion that I'd been manipulative or controlling. "How often did you visit your grandfather?" he asked. "Every week," I answered. "Sunday dinners." "And did you initiate these visits, or did he—" "It was a tradition we both maintained," I said carefully. "When I was a child, it was just what we did. As an adult, I continued it because I wanted to." "Did he ever try to cancel, ever say he was too tired or too busy?" "Of course," I said, "when he was sick or when he had conflicts, but we'd always reschedule." Dale leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And when he was sick, you took care of him, didn't you?" "Yes," I said. "Made him dependent on you." "I helped him when he needed help," I said, keeping my voice level even though I wanted to scream. "That's what family does." Or what someone does when they're positioning themselves to inherit millions of dollars. "Objection," Amelia cut in, argumentative. The deposition went on for 6 hours. By the end, I was exhausted mentally and emotionally drained. Celeste's deposition was next, and Amelia demolished her. She started gentle asking about Celeste's childhood, her relationship with her father, and then she started asking about me. "Ms. Thorne, when did you last speak to your daughter before Judge Sterling died?" Celeste hesitated, clearly trying to remember. "I'm not sure exactly," she said. "Was it within the year before his death?" "I don't recall," she said, her voice tight. Amelia pulled out phone records. "According to these records, which document all calls to and from Judge Sterling's phone number, the last time you called him was 14 months before his death. Is that consistent with your memory?" "I suppose so," Celeste said. "And what was that phone call about?" "I was calling to check on him." Amelia pulled out a bank record. Interesting, she said. Because 2 days after that phone call, Judge Sterling wired you $15,000. Was that a coincidence? I had been having some financial difficulties, Celeste said defensively. He offered to help. Did you ask him for money during that call? I may have mentioned my situation. This continued. Amelia went through every instance of contact between Celeste and my grandfather over the past 10 years, and almost every single one was connected to a request for money. She asked about visits, and Celeste could only clearly remember 4 over the past decade, each lasting less than a week. Then Amelia asked about me. Ms. Thorne, do you know where your daughter attended law school? Celeste paused. Some school in Charleston, I believe. Which one? I don't remember the specific name. It was the University of South Carolina School of Law. Amelia said, her voice cold. One of the top law schools in the region. She graduated top of her class. Did you attend her graduation? I couldn't afford the travel, Celeste said. Amelia pulled out credit card statements. According to these statements which we've subpoenaed, you were in Paris that weekend. You stayed at a 5-star hotel and spent over $8,000. Is that consistent with not being able to afford travel to your daughter's law school graduation? Celeste's face went red. That was different, she said. That was a business opportunity. What business were you in at that time? I was exploring options. According to your tax returns from that year, you listed your occupation as unemployed. Is that correct? The deposition continued in this vein for hours. By the end, Celeste was flustered and angry, and Roger Dale looked worried. But Dale had one more card to play, and he played it 2 weeks later. Dr. William Barrett. I was in my office when Amelia called. We have a problem, she said. Dale has submitted a new witness, a doctor who claims he treated your grandfather in the final months of his life and noticed signs of cognitive decline. That's impossible, I said immediately. Grandpa's doctor was Dr. Chin. She saw him regularly, and he was completely sharp. I know, Amelia said. But this Dr. Barrett is claiming he provided a second opinion at Celeste's request because she was worried about her father's mental state. And he's prepared to testify that Judge Sterling showed signs of confusion and memory loss. My heart sank. Can he do that? Can he just show up with a new witness this late? Unfortunately, yes, Amelia said. And it's a smart move by Dale. Even if we can discredit this doctor, the mere suggestion that your grandfather might have been confused will plant doubt. The next hearing was the following week, and Dr. Barrett was there. He was in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive suit with perfectly styled gray hair and an air of professional authority. He had the kind of presence that made you want to trust him, which made him dangerous. Roger Dale called him to the stand. Dr. Barrett, he began, can you tell the court about your interactions with Judge David Sterling? Dr. Barrett settled into the witness chair, looking comfortable and confident. I met Judge Sterling twice in the final months of his life, he said. His daughter, Ms. Celeste Thorne, had contacted me expressing concerns about her father's mental state. She asked if I could conduct an evaluation. And what did you find? Dr. Barrett sighed a perfectly pitched expression of professional concern. I found signs consistent with early-stage cognitive decline. Memory lapses, confusion about recent events, difficulty following complex conversations. Nothing severe yet, but definitely concerning for a man who had once had such a sharp mind. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This was all lies. My grandfather had been sharp as a tack. Just weeks before he died, he'd helped me with the Peterson case, had remembered details from similar cases from 30 years ago. Did you recommend any treatment? Dale asked. I suggested some medications to help manage the symptoms, and I encouraged Ms. Thorne to consider arrangements for her father's care as the condition progressed. And did Judge Sterling seem aware of his condition? Dr. Barrett shook his head sadly. That's often the tragedy of these cases. The patient doesn't realize how much they've declined. They believe they're still functioning normally. Dale looked satisfied. Thank you, doctor. No further questions. Amelia stood up for cross-examination, and I could see the steel in her eyes. She was going to destroy him. Dr. Barrett, she began, you said you met with Judge Sterling twice. When were these meetings? In the final month of his life, Dr. Barrett said. The exact dates are in my notes. Amelia pulled out a calendar. According to the records we've obtained, Judge Sterling died on February 18th. Can you specify when you met with him? February 2nd and February 12th, Dr. Barrett said, checking his notes. And how long were these appointments? The first was approximately 45 minutes. The second was about 30 minutes. Amelia looked at the judge. So, to be clear, Dr. Barrett is basing his assessment of cognitive decline on 2 appointments totaling 75 minutes with a patient he'd never met before. Is that correct? That's sufficient time for a preliminary evaluation, Dr. Barrett said, but he was starting to look uncomfortable. Amelia pulled out a thick file. I have here the complete medical records of Judge Sterling from his primary care physician, Dr. Patricia Chin, who treated him for 30 years. Dr. Chin conducted a full cognitive assessment 4 months before Judge Sterling's death. Would you like to know what she found? I'm sure Dr. Chin is competent, Dr. Barrett started, but Amelia cut him off. She found perfect cognitive function, Amelia said, her voice hard. Perfect. Score of 30 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination. Perfect recall, perfect orientation, perfect executive function. How do you explain that? Tests can be fallible, Dr. Barrett said weakly. Amelia walked towards him. Dr. Barrett, where were you practicing before you opened your office in Charleston? In Atlanta, he said. Specifically where? At a private clinic, he said, his discomfort growing. Reynolds Medical Group, Amelia supplied. Owned and operated by Dr. Thomas Reynolds, who is Celeste Thorne's cousin. Is that correct? The courtroom went completely silent. Dr. Barrett's face had gone pale. I don't see how that's relevant, he said. You don't see how it's relevant that you worked for the first cousin of the woman who hired you to evaluate her father, and that this evaluation conveniently supports her lawsuit to overturn his will. Amelia's voice was ice cold now. It was a professional consultation, Dr. Barrett insisted. Amelia pulled out more documents. Did you bill Ms. Thorne for these consultations? Dr. Barrett hesitated. She paid for my time, yes. How much did she pay you? Another hesitation. $5,000. For 2 appointments totaling 75 minutes, that's quite expensive. I have certain expertise, Dr. Barrett said defensively. Yes, Amelia said. The expertise of providing convenient diagnoses for people who need them. Dr. Barrett, did you prescribe any medication to Judge Sterling? Yes, Dr. Barrett said, a mild sedative for anxiety and sleep. Amelia pulled out pharmacy records. This prescription was filled, but according to Judge Sterling's medication organizer, which was maintained by his housekeeper Martha Williams and is now in evidence, he never took this medication. The bottle was found unopened after his death. Why would you prescribe a medication that the patient didn't need? He may have forgotten to take it, Dr. Barrett said, but his confidence was crumbling. It's common with cognitive decline. Or Amelia suggested he never intended to take it because he wasn't confused or anxious, and this prescription was manufactured as false evidence of cognitive issues that didn't exist. Objection, Roger Dale called. Speculation. Withdrawn, Amelia said. No further questions. Dr. Barrett left the stand looking shaken, and the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Judge Morrison called a recess, and as we filed out, I saw Celeste and Roger Dale in a heated discussion in the corner, his face red with anger, her gesturing frantically. That evening, Amelia and I met in her office to discuss strategy. We're winning, she said firmly. Barrett's testimony was a disaster for them. His connection to Celeste's cousin undermines his credibility, and Dr. Chin's records are ironclad. But I prompted because I could hear it in her voice. But she admitted trials are unpredictable. We need to be prepared for anything. Dale is desperate, and desperate lawyers do unpredictable things. She was right. The next week, Roger Dale filed a motion to admit additional evidence, specifically my grandfather's financial records for the final year of his life. He claimed that there were irregular transactions that suggested undue influence. When we reviewed the records, I saw what he was going to use. In the final 6 months of my grandfather's life, there had been several large transfers between his checking account and a savings account in his name. The amounts varied anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000, moved in and out at seemingly random intervals. He's going to claim you were siphoning money, Amelia said, studying the records, making it look like he was moving funds when really you were stealing from him. But I didn't do any of that. I said, confused. I never had access to his accounts. I know, Amelia said. So we need to figure out what these transactions actually were. It took 3 days of investigation, but we finally figured it out. My grandfather, ever the meticulous planner, had been moving money to maximize interest rates and minimize tax liability. He'd consulted with a financial advisor, and every single transaction had documentation to support it. More than that, the paperwork showed that my grandfather had initiated every transaction himself, had signed every document, and had clear reasoning for every decision. When we presented this evidence along with testimony from the financial advisor, Roger Dale's theory collapsed. But he tried one more angle. He called Celeste to the stand as a witness, and his questioning took a different turn. Ms. Thorne, he asked, can you tell the court about your relationship with your daughter Maya? Celeste dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, a performance that was almost impressive in its artifice. I've always loved Maya, she said, her voice breaking. She's my daughter. I gave birth to her. Nothing can change that. And yet you left her with your parents when she was 4 months old, Dale prompted, as if he was bringing up something painful for her benefit. I was young, Celeste said. 26 years old, struggling, scared. My marriage to Gregory was falling apart. I was depressed. I thought giving Maya to my parents temporarily would be best for everyone. And did you intend for it to be permanent? Never, Celeste said, and the tears were flowing now. I always planned to get back on my feet and bring her home. But by the time I was stable, years had passed and my parents had essentially taken over. They made it clear I wasn't welcome. I felt Amelia tense beside me. This was a new angle. Celeste was trying to claim that my grandparents had kept her away, that she'd wanted to be part of my life but had been prevented. Can you give examples of times when Judge Sterling prevented you from seeing Maya, Dale asked. Celeste nodded. When Maya was 5, I called to arrange a visit. My father told me it would be too disruptive, that Maya was settled and happy, and my presence would only confuse her. This was a lie. I knew it was a lie, and I knew Amelia would prove it. Ms. Thorne. Amelia began when it was her turn for cross-examination. You testified that Judge Sterling told you your visit would be too disruptive when Maya was 5. Do you have any documentation of this conversation? It was a phone call, Celeste said. I didn't record it. Amelia pulled out phone records. These are Judge Sterling's phone records from the year Maya was 5. I don't see any incoming calls from any number associated with you during that year. Can you explain that? Celeste's face flushed. Maybe I'm misremembering the exact year. Maybe you're misremembering the entire conversation, Amelia suggested. Ms. Thorne. I have here the visitor log from Judge Sterling's home, which he meticulously maintained for security purposes given his position. Over the 30 years Maya lived there, you are listed as visiting a total of 18 times. 18 times in 30 years, Ms. Thorne, an average of once every 20 months. Is that consistent with someone who desperately wanted to be part of their daughter's life but was being kept away? Celeste was silent. I also have here, Amelia continued, several letters that Judge Sterling sent you over the years. Letters asking you to visit. Letters telling you that Maya was asking about you. Letters offering to pay for your travel. Would you like me to read them? That's not necessary, Celeste said quietly. In one letter dated when Maya was 7, Judge Sterling wrote, and I quote, Maya waited by the window until midnight on her birthday. She was so sure you'd come this time because you'd promised. How many more times will you break her heart before you realize the damage you're doing? Does that sound like a man who was trying to keep you away from your daughter? Celeste had no answer. The trial continued like this for weeks. Dale would try a new angle, and Amelia would dismantle it with evidence, with testimony, with the documented truth of 30 years of absence. Martha testified fierce and protective about watching me grow up, about the Sunday dinners, about my grandfather's love for me. Chief Justice Avery testified about my grandfather's mental acuity, about his deliberate choice in making his will, about his pride in me. Colleagues from the prosecutor's office testified about my character, about my integrity, about the kind of person I was. And then it was my turn to testify. I took the stand on a Thursday morning in late May. The courtroom was packed. The case had generated enough attention that there were reporters present, members of the legal community who wanted to see how it would unfold, and curious onlookers who'd followed the story in the news. Amelia started with easy questions. My childhood, my education, my relationship with my grandparents. I talked about Sunday dinners, about learning to make pot roast, about my grandmother's garden and my grandfather's law books. Tell the court about the last year of your grandfather's life, Amelia said. I took a breath. The last year was beautiful, I said. He was slowing down, sleeping more, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He helped me prepare for cases. We still had Sunday dinners. We still talked about everything from politics to old movies to what flowers we'd plant in the spring. Was he ever confused or disoriented? Never, I said firmly. Not once. He could recall cases from 50 years ago with perfect clarity. He could discuss current events and legal precedents. He could beat me at chess, which he'd been doing since I was 10 years old. He was not confused. "And did you ever discuss his will with him?" "Yes," I said. He'd shown it to me 10 years earlier, and in the last year of his life, he brought it up a few times. He wanted to make sure I understood his reasoning. He wanted me to know that he'd chosen me deliberately, carefully, with full knowledge of what he was doing. "What did he say?" I felt tears starting, but I pushed through. "He said that family was defined by choice, by who shows up, by who stays. He said that I'd been his daughter in every way that mattered for 30 years, and that this was his way of acknowledging that." When it was Roger Dale's turn for cross-examination, he came at me aggressively. "Ms. Sterling, isn't it true that you benefited financially from being close to your grandfather?" "I had a place to live and support growing up, yes," I said. "That's what parents do for children." "But you weren't his child," Dale said. "You were his granddaughter, and now you're set to inherit millions." "My grandfather chose to leave me his estate," I said carefully. "I didn't ask for it. I didn't manipulate him for it. I was part of his life because I loved him." Dale paced in front of the witness stand. "Isn't it true that you isolated him from his daughter?" "No," I said. "I never prevented Celeste from visiting. She chose not to come." "But you never encouraged their relationship, did you? You never suggested he reach out to her." I took a breath, feeling anger rise. I was a child for most of their relationship. It wasn't my job to facilitate a relationship between a father and his adult daughter who couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone. And as an adult, I watched my grandfather reach out to her repeatedly and be ignored or used for money. So no, I didn't encourage him to keep subjecting himself to that pain. Dale tried several more angles. He asked about my career as a prosecutor, implying I was skilled at manipulation because I convinced juries. He asked about my finances, implying I was motivated by greed. He asked about my relationship with Amelia, implying there was some conspiracy between us. But I held firm. I answered every question honestly, calmly, and by the time he was finished, I could see frustration on his face. The trial was winding down. We were approaching closing arguments, and I felt cautiously optimistic. We'd presented overwhelming evidence. Dr. Chen's medical records, Martha's testimony, Chief Justice Avery's character witness, the financial documentation showing my grandfather's clear mind, the letters and journals documenting 30 years of abandonment by Celeste. But Roger Dale had one final move, and it came during his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the court, "this case comes down to one fundamental question. What is family? Is it biology, the undeniable connection of blood and genetics, or is it something else?" He gestured to Celeste, who was crying quietly in her seat. "My client made mistakes. She was young, she was scared, she made choices she wishes she could take back. But she is still Maya Sterling's mother. That is a biological fact that cannot be erased." He turned to face me. And while Maya Sterling may have been present in Judge Sterling's life, we must ask ourselves why. Was it genuine love, or was it because she knew where she stood to benefit? Was it selfless devotion, or was it a calculated investment that has now paid off handsomely? He paused for effect. Judge Sterling was a brilliant man, but brilliant men can still be manipulated, especially when they're grieving, lonely, and dependent on someone for their daily care. The law recognizes that children have a right to their parents' estates. That's why intestate succession exists. And while Judge Sterling tried to circumvent that law with his will, we must ask whether that will truly reflected his wishes, or whether it reflected the undue influence of a granddaughter who had spent 30 years positioning herself as the heir. He sat down looking pleased with himself. Then Amelia stood for her closing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply looked at the judge and began to speak. "Your Honor," she said, "Mr. Dale is right about one thing. This case is about family, but he's wrong about everything else." She walked toward the center of the courtroom. "Celeste Thorne wants this court to believe that biology trumps everything else. That because she gave birth to Maya Sterling, she deserves to benefit from an inheritance she never earned. But I ask this court to consider what Judge David Sterling, a man who spent 43 years serving justice, believed family meant." She gestured to the evidence tables. "We have submitted into evidence 30 years of documentation, phone records showing that Celeste rarely called her father except when she needed money, bank records showing $845,000 in transfers to Celeste over the years, letters from Judge Sterling begging his daughter to visit to be part of Maya's life letters that went unanswered, journals from Elena Sterling documenting a little girl waiting by the window for parents who never came. Amelia's voice grew stronger. We have submitted testimony from Dr. Patricia Chin, who treated Judge Sterling for 3 decades and confirmed he was in perfect cognitive health. We have testimony from Martha Williams, who witnessed 30 years of Sunday dinners and Maya's devotion to her grandparents. We have testimony from Chief Justice Marcus Avery, who knew Judge Sterling professionally for 40 years and confirms that he made his will carefully, deliberately, and with full understanding. She turned to face Celeste. And what has Ms. Thorne submitted? A doctor with questionable credibility who spent 75 minutes with Judge Sterling and has financial ties to Ms. Thorne's family. Testimony from Ms. Thorne herself that contradicts phone records and documented evidence. Accusations of manipulation without a single piece of evidence to support them. Amelia walked back toward our table, and I saw tears in her eyes. Judge David Sterling left us a letter explaining his reasoning. He wrote, "Family is not determined by biology, but by choice, by presence, by love, demonstrated through consistent action." He wrote, "Maya chose to be my family every single day for 30 years. He wrote, "She earned this inheritance through loyalty and love, and I hope it provides her with security as she continues her important work." She faced the judge one final time. This court must decide whether to honor the carefully considered wishes of a brilliant legal mind, a man who spent his entire career serving justice, or whether to overturn those wishes because a woman who abandoned her daughter 30 years ago has decided she wants the money after all. I trust this court will make the right decision. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Judge Morrison looked at both sides, her expression unreadable. "I'll take this under advisement," she said. "We'll reconvene in 1 week for my ruling." That week was the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I went through the motions of my job, but my mind was constantly on the trial, running through every piece of testimony, every argument, wondering if we'd done enough. Amelia kept assuring me we'd presented an overwhelming case, but she also warned me that judges were unpredictable. Sometimes they made decisions based on factors we couldn't anticipate. Sometimes they surprised everyone. The night before the ruling, I went to my grandfather's study. I sat in his chair, surrounded by his books, and I talked to him like he was still there. "I did my best, Grandpa," I said out loud. "I fought for what you wanted. I fought for the truth. I hope that's enough." The courtroom was even more packed for the ruling than it had been for the trial. Every seat was filled and people were standing in the back. The media presence had grown. This case had become bigger than just one family's dispute. It had become a referendum on what family meant, on the value of presence versus biology. Judge Morrison entered, and we all stood. When she sat, she looked directly at me, then at Celeste, and then she began to speak. "This case," she said, "has required me to consider fundamental questions about family inheritance and justice. I have reviewed extensive evidence, heard compelling testimony from both sides, and spent considerable time considering the law and precedent." She paused, and my heart was pounding so hard, I thought everyone in the courtroom must be able to hear it. The plaintiffs argued that biological relationships should take precedence in inheritance matters. They argue that Judge Sterling's will should be overturned on the basis of undue influence and lack of capacity. They have asked this court to essentially declare that a daughter's biological right to inherit supersedes a granddaughter's demonstrated dedication. Another pause. I couldn't breathe. However, she continued after careful consideration of all evidence presented, "I find the plaintiff's arguments to be without merit." Relief crashed over me, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "The evidence clearly shows that Judge David Sterling was in full command of his mental faculties when he made his will." Dr. Patricia Chin's records are comprehensive and unimpeachable. Her cognitive assessments conducted throughout Judge Sterling's life, and specifically in the months before his death, show no signs of dementia, confusion, or diminished capacity. In contrast, Dr. Barrett's testimony was undermined by his limited contact with Judge Sterling, his financial relationship with the plaintiffs, and his connection to Ms. Thorne's family. She looked directly at Celeste now. As to the question of undue influence, the evidence overwhelmingly shows that Maya Sterling did not manipulate Judge Sterling. Rather, she was present. She was devoted. She maintained a relationship based on genuine love and mutual respect. The documentation submitted by the defense, including phone records, visitor logs, letters, and journals, paints a clear picture of 30 years of consistent presence by Maya Sterling and consistent absence by Celeste Thorne. Judge Morrison picked up my grandfather's letter. Judge Sterling left a detailed explanation of his reasoning. His words are clear, thoughtful, and deliberate. He understood exactly what he was doing and why. He chose to leave his estate to Maya Sterling not because he was confused or manipulated, but because she had been his family in every meaningful sense for 30 years. She set the letter down. This court recognizes that family is complex and multifaceted. Biology creates a relationship, but it does not in and of itself create love, devotion, or loyalty. Those things must be earned through presence, through consistency, through choosing to show up day after day, year after year. Judge Sterling made his choice. He chose to recognize the family member who had chosen him. This court will honor that choice. The gavel came down sharp and final. The will of Judge David Sterling is hereby validated in its entirety. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed with prejudice, meaning this issue cannot be relitigated. Furthermore, due to the frivolous nature of this lawsuit and the time and resources required to defend against baseless claims, the plaintiffs are ordered to pay the defendants reasonable attorney fees in accordance with state law governing frivolous litigation. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were rushing to get out and file their stories. People were talking over each other, but I was just sitting there, tears streaming down my face, Amelia's arm around my shoulders. "We won," Amelia whispered. "We won." I turned to look at Celeste and Gregory. Celeste's face was white as paper, her eyes wide with shock. Gregory looked like he might be sick. Roger Dale was already packing his briefcase, his face tight with anger and frustration. As people filed out, Celeste tried one more time to approach me. "Maya," she started, but I held up my hand. "No," I said quietly. "You had 30 years to be my mother. You chose not to. You had this trial to prove you cared about anything other than money. You failed. We're done here." She opened her mouth to argue, but Gregory put his hand on her arm and pulled her away. I watched them leave this couple who had brought me into the world and then abandoned me, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a kind of hollow relief that it was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me. "Ms. Sterling, how do you feel about the verdict? What do you want to say to your biological mother? What are you going to do with the inheritance?" Amelia fielded most of the questions, but I did give one statement. "Judge David Sterling was the finest man I ever knew," I said. "He taught me about justice, about integrity, and about what family really means." This verdict honors his wishes and his memory, and I'm grateful to the court for recognizing the truth. Family isn't about biology. It's about who shows up, who stays, and who loves you not just with words, but with consistent action. That's what my grandfather and grandmother taught me, and that's what I'll carry forward for the rest of my life. The reporters seemed satisfied with that, and Amelia and I made our way to her car. Once we were safely inside, away from the cameras and the questions, I finally let myself break down completely. "We won," I sobbed. "We actually won." "Of course we won," Amelia said, but she was crying too. We had the truth on our side. We always did. That weekend, I went to the cemetery. It was a beautiful June day, the hibiscus in full bloom, and I brought fresh flowers for my grandparents' shared grave. I also brought a slice of Martha's lemon poppy seed cake wrapped carefully in wax paper, which I left on the headstone. "I kept my promise," I said quietly, kneeling beside the grave. "I protected what you built. I protected your legacy. And I won. We won." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. "Of course you won, Maya. You always had the strength. You just needed to find it." I stayed there for a long time telling them about the trial, about all the people who had testified on my behalf, about Amelia's brilliance and Martha's fierce protection. I told them about the verdict, about the judge's words, about how their decision had been validated and honored. And I promised them that I would use this inheritance the way they would have wanted. Not selfishly, not wastefully, but to make a difference. 6 months later, I stood in a different courtroom, this time wearing the black robes of a judge. At 35 years old, I'd become the youngest circuit court judge in South Carolina's history. The appointment had come through partly because of my record as a prosecutor, partly because of Chief Justice Avery's strong recommendation, and partly, I believed, because of the way I'd fought for truth and justice in my own case. My first case as a judge was a custody dispute. A father who'd been absent for 7 years was suing for custody, claiming his biological rights as a parent. The mother who'd raised the child alone through those years was terrified of losing her son. I listened to the evidence. I reviewed the documentation. I heard testimony about years of absence of broken promises of child support never paid. And I heard testimony about a mother who'd been there every day through sickness and health, through good times and bad. When it came time for my ruling, I looked at the father, this man who wanted to claim parental rights without having done the work of being a parent. Children don't remember what we promised them, I said. They remember who was there, who showed up to school plays and doctor's appointments, who made them feel safe and loved, who chose to be present even when it was hard. I awarded full custody to the mother with supervised visitation only for the father pending demonstrated commitment to building a relationship with his son. After court, several lawyers approached me to comment on my ruling. One, an older man who'd practiced family law for decades, shook my hand. "That was brave Judge Sterling," he said. "Not everyone has the courage to prioritize presence over biology." "It's not courage," I said. "It's justice, and it's what I was taught." Martha still came to my house every Saturday to make lemon poppy seed cake. She was 73 now, moved a little slower, but she refused to stop. "Some traditions shouldn't end," she would say, even when the people who started them are gone. I still had Sunday dinners, though. Now they were with my chosen family. Amelia came regularly, along with colleagues from the prosecutor's office who'd become genuine friends. Chief Justice Avery stopped by when he could. We'd eat pot roast and mashed potatoes, and we'd tell stories, and we'd laugh, and we'd be present with each other. That's what mattered. Presence. Choice. Love demonstrated through action. I never heard from Celeste or Gregory again. After they paid Amelia's attorney fees, which totaled over $300,000, they disappeared from my life as completely as they'd been absent from it for 30 years. I heard through the grapevine that they'd moved to Florida, that they'd filed for bankruptcy, that their marriage had finally fallen apart under the weight of their mutual blame for the failed lawsuit. I felt nothing when I heard this. No satisfaction, no sadness, nothing. They'd made their choices, and those choices had consequences. My grandfather's money, that $3.4 million that Celeste and Gregory had wanted so badly, went to work in ways that honored his memory. I kept the house the place where I'd grown up, where Sunday dinners had been held, where love had been demonstrated every day. I kept enough to live comfortably to continue my work without financial worry. The rest went to establishing the David and Elena Sterling Foundation, which provided support for grandparents raising grandchildren for children in foster care for programs that helped build stable, loving families, regardless of biological connection. Every dollar that foundation spent was a testament to what my grandparents had believed. That family is choice. That love is action. That presence matters more than biology. In my chambers, I hung a photo from my 8th birthday. I'm wearing a paper crown, and my grandfather is helping me blow out candles while my grandmother laughs in the background. Below it, I framed my grandfather's letter, the one he'd written explaining his choice. Visitors often stopped to read it, and more than once I saw them wipe away tears. The most important sentence, the one that guided every decision I made on the bench, was this: "A parent is not defined by biology, but by presence. A family is not determined by blood, but by choice. I choose you because you chose me every single day for 30 years. That's justice, that's love, that's family. And in the end, that's all that really matters. Who stays, who shows up, who loves you not just with words, but with their whole life." So here's what I want to know from you. What does family mean to you? Is it about blood, or is it about the people who show up? Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone who claimed to love you but never proved it through their actions? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding strength, setting boundaries, and defining family on your own terms. Because at the end of the day, you deserve people who choose you every single day, just like my grandparents chose me.